Our next speaker is Sofie Lourdes Jensen. Sofie is a trained clinical psychologist, and she got into the service design world by chance while working with choice architecture in a project at a bank. Her work focuses on exploring how to best combine psychology and service design. So she's very active in the behavior science scene in Oslo, where she connects academics, business people, and students to further the field of choice architecture. So there have been a lot of discussions about the application for behavior science within service design, and Sofie's talk will focus on how to do this in an ethical and just way. Please welcome Sofie Lourdes Jensen.
Thank you. There. Oh, yeah. And I will also share my screen so that we presentation. I tried hard to make it presentation worthy. Okay, let's just jump into it. Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk on behavioral design. My name is Sofie, and I work with behavioral design at Design It. And my talk today is about my work at defining behavioral design in practice, combining principles from choice architecture with design thinking. But I wanted to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I do not have all the answers here, and I am still on a journey of discovery. Nevertheless, I still hope that my learning so far can be of use for others who are interested in the merge of behavioral designs with design. So let me take you with me on my journey. We will start with a short introduction to behavioral design as I define it, followed by why it's worth caring about, and then an example from our practice here at Design It that I've done with other service designers. Finally, I will end with a reflection on what I consider to be key action points for a more ethical and sustainable use of behavioral design. Before we begin, I would like to take you through a few key terms for this kind of topic, and that is some cognitive psychology elements here. So we have heuristic, which is cognitive shortcuts, so mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that simplify decisions. Then we have bias, which is systematic errors of judgment due to those heuristics, which result in predictable patterns of behavior under certain conditions. Then there's choice architecture, as I've mentioned, which is the organization of the situation characteristics in decision-making context. Finally, we have nudging, which is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. So this is a bit of a mouthful, but just to give you a little bit of an introduction to key terms that I will be using. So, behavioral design. Behavioral design, as I define it, is the merger of the principles from behavioral sciences with design thinking methodology. My point of entry into the field was reading the work of Kahneman and Tversky as a fresh-faced psychology student. They found through extensive research that we humans, to make all the decisions necessary to function in a day, have two systems of decision-making. System one, which handles the greater bulk of decisional moments through our day, is fast, unconscious, and low effort. Because of it, we can decide on what to eat for lunch while being distracted thinking on an important work task. System one is quick because it uses a lot of those mental shortcuts or heuristics and general rules of thumb based on experience and the slow evolution of man. What worked to keep your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother alive will probably work for you too, System one reckons. System two, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, and conscious, and it requires high effort. This is the system we activate for the big problems in life that don't have a quick fix or rule associated with them, or for logical reasoning around, for example, mathematical questions. Because System 1 works with those rules of thumb or heuristics, it makes it a bit vulnerable to systemic biases in decision-making, a type of blind spot, as we sometimes filter away important information. Some of those heuristics are also not optimized for a modern lifestyle, where rather than tigers, we have to worry about climate change and coronary heart disease. This knowledge was built upon by, amongst others, Thaler and Sunstein, who showed how these biases could be used as a way of nudging people in certain directions of finance, health, and sustainability, where we often see people choose alternatives that are not necessarily in line with their long-term goals. And as you can see, I've illustrated here with a couple of these books that that summarize some of the research and findings that I'm referring to here. So based on these insights, multiple frameworks have been developed to design the decision-making context to increase the likelihood of certain behavioral outcomes. The effects of these nudges can be striking. Programs from the US and UK have seen an increase in everything from private retirement savings to more energy-saving behavior. Here in Norway, we have an example from Mindshift, where they saw a 145% increase in the use of trash cans for cigarette butts after the use of choice architecture in a borough in Oslo. My current version of behavioral design combines the methods defined in the framework BASIC by the OECD with service and system design and a triple diamond approach, as defined by Stimulab of the Norwegian government and Design and Architecture in Norway, or DORA. My entry into the field was inspired by the work of Don Norman on combining behavioral sciences with design. In the BASIC model, the steps are as follows. Examine the behavior patterns of today, analyze what drives these behavioral patterns, design a strategy for changing these behavior patterns, develop interventions to realize the strategy and nudge people in a certain direction, and then document the learnings and adjust or scale based on the learnings from the interventions phase. And this is the change. So at the top here, you see this lined out with the 5 different steps. And at first glance, these steps seem to map pretty well onto the triple diamond seen below, with behavior analysis for understand, strategy for envision, and intervention and change for prototype and implementation. But this similarity is deceptive, because for the firstly, a service design insight understand phase is not the same as behavior and analysis, because the approach, perspective, and goal is fundamentally different. In choice architecture, the goal is to understand the behavior of the many, while in service design, we often look for the emotions and experiences of the few. This behavior versus emotion and broad versus deep distinction creates very different needs and gathering of data, and must be taken heed of when we wish to combine the 2 approaches. The same can be seen with testing versus intervention and change. As choice architecture relies on documenting behavior change as proof of concept, there needs to be an observation of the choices and behavior over time, and it must be compared to a baseline or control group to document whether there is a significant change. In design, on the other hand, you often simply want to understand how users perceive a solution, their evaluation and understanding of it, which is much easier to gauge based on dialogue and testing with simple prototypes. In conclusion, if we wish to engage in behavioral design, we need to understand the model and rationale, as well as the theoretical framework that lies behind both approaches, before we can integrate them in a valid manner. So now we know a little bit about, oh, I forgot to press next. Well, here you see a summary of what I just said. So now that we've had a little bit about what it is, we can look briefly at the question of why. Why should we engage in behavioral design? My reason is that I believe that the 2 approaches complement each other and push further than one can do alone. And I want to take you to an example from our practice that I believe illustrates this, as well as a few of the challenges and opportunities latent in behavioral design. So this is the project CLOP, which we did together with Menon Economics for the Brønnøysund Registers and Work Welfare Services, or NAV, in Norway. Here in Norway, people are financially responsible for their single-person enterprises, which makes them more exposed to the risk of unmanageable debt. The Brønnøysund Registers are responsible for the registers of all businesses in Norway, and so have several contact points with these single-person enterprises and their owners. They wanted to see whether they could do something to reduce the risk of unmanageable debt in this user group by adjusting their points of contact and ways of interacting with them. So a very exciting project. My role was to look at the choice architecture of the contact points from a behavioral design standpoint, although the main approach of the project was still service design due to the requirements linked to the government funding. Therefore, we applied the basic framework within the service design process, integrating the different steps to work together and in parallel. This project taught me a lot about behavioral design in practice, both due to what worked, but mostly due to what went wrong or the challenges that we faced. The first challenge, main challenge, was the fact that basic and other choice architecture frameworks lie along a longer timeline and a different scope than service design projects. When service design projects end, the intervention and change steps are just beginning. Therefore, we have reworked the model where the service design timeline is now integrated into a basic model rather than the other way around. The second main challenge was involving the members of the project group that did not have previous knowledge of choice architecture. Whereas in service design, the client is the topic expert and can easily participate in ideation around possible solutions or interventions, their expertise only takes them a bit of the way when thinking about possible solutions to nudging behavior, as they do not know the mechanisms behind the different biases and what has been found to work to alleviate these effects before. To address these challenges, we first spent some time during the insight phase to introduce key biases observed in the current behavior patterns. We then used the learnings from the previous phases to define hypotheses and interventions to address the issues uncovered in these phases, that being behavioral analysis and strategy. This we then mapped out onto the user journey in what we called a nudge diagram. This nudge diagram clearly indicated what biases are thought to lie behind the behavior, increasing risk of unmanageable debt at the different time points, together with a description of an intervention to address it. The intervention is described with suggested text and content, and it also contains a model for testing the suggested intervention. The map thus enables our client with limited previous knowledge of choice architecture to engage in the process of implementation and evaluation of the interventions so that the intervention and change steps may be completed. And this is currently in the works at the Brønnøysund Registers. Although there were plenty of valuable learnings in this project, we did not get to properly test our hypothesis as mentioned, and it's thus not a complete behavioral design project. I therefore urge anyone considering applying these tools in a project to include space in their budget for a thorough testing of the interventions, as this is a must-have in behavioral design. We have another example that I would like to highlight as well, as I feel it illustrates another value of integrating behavioral design as a perspective for designers. And that is that to some degree, designers are already engaging in intuitive choice architecture. Take, for example, the work done by my colleagues on a project for an exercise chain in Norway called SOS. They incorporated a social element in their exercise app solution based on feedback from users. This is one of the key interventions from choice architecture, using social commitment to increase the likelihood of performing a behavior. If they had known, it would be both easier to, if they had known about this, they would be able to stand on the shoulders of previous work within this and thus push their solution even further. And then a look at the ethics side of this, because as you have seen, there's considerable power in the use of choice architecture and behavioral design. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. And let's take a look at the main arguments that we often see against the use of choice architecture. And the first issue I see a lot is that behavioral design and choice architecture reduces freedom of choice by making some alternatives unrealistic, even though theoretically it is still available. This is something to be aware of, especially when engaging in the use of defaults or other choice restricting nudges. But a counter to this argument is that a decision context is still there, even if you don't engage in choice architecture, and it will still influence people's lives. And the question then becomes, is it better that the influence is arbitrary, even if it takes them, the people and the users away from their intended goals? The second question is whether it distracts from wider systemic change by focusing on the behavior of individuals instead of systemic reform. There's also the question of manipulation. I see I skipped that one. And that choice architecture is used to subvert people into acting in a way that benefits others. And this is not theoretical, because we've already seen the tendencies of such use in the design of, for example, digital spaces, or in the way stores organize their goods. Finally, there's the question of whether this is based on overgeneralized findings from middle class, upper class neighborhoods, mostly done in the UK and the US, and with the majority population. This is not an unfamiliar critique, as it can be extended to almost all research within psychology. But then I still believe that we should engage in behavioral design despite all of these challenges. And at the same time, I also believe that we must take action to address these challenges. So here are my 4 takeaways, and then I will leave you in the hands of the next presenter. The first is to stop referring to irrational and rational behaviors. Saying that one behavior is rational is making an evaluative judgment on what is right to do in another person's life. And we should be very careful in doing that. I therefore propose that we instead focus on whether a behavior is congruent with the person's own goals or not. And this leads to the second point, co-determination through co-creation. This is where choice architecture has a lot to gain from service design. When evaluating which options to front or what behaviors to nudge, go to the users themselves and ask them what they want to achieve in their lives. Then design the context to help them achieve those goals. To further serve this goal of co-determination, also make sure that you always have a realistic opt-out or a way of deflecting your nudges for those who wish to act differently. Let us also address the question of manipulation in another way, and that is the use of transparency. Unlike illusions, behavioral design is not dependent on smoke and mirrors. You can tell people exactly how you intend to design the decision context and why, and it will still work. Isn't that amazing? Fowler himself points to this ideal of transparency as a criterion of good choice architecture. Finally, as always, I think we can say, it is important that we respect the complexity of real life and the limits of our methods. This especially goes to understanding who was part of the sample that made your data and who that might generalize to. It also means taking the time to understand the wider system in which an intervention or change is being implemented into. How might this change affect other parts of the system or of people's lives? In relation to this, it is essential that we always test and measure effects of interventions so that we know how it affects, because we can only hypothesize at the beginning. It is important to keep in mind that not all problems can be fixed with a small, cheap intervention, but some can. And if we engage in these corrective actions, I believe we can use behavioral design to help citizens achieve healthier, more financially stable, and more sustainable lives. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that talk, Sophia. Before we move on to the next speaker, I want to encourage you to join the conversation over on Twitter with the hashtag SDGC21.